Hello, I'm Richard Kay. I'm the editor-at-large at the Daily Mail, but I'm also a long-time royal writer for the newspaper and have been covering the royals since the 1980s. And today I'm very happy to be here to answer some of your questions, our readers and viewers of Palace Confidential, about the late Princess Diana. I became friends with Diana during the course of my time as the royal correspondent of the paper, and we became very good friends in the last 5 or 6 years of her life. So it's a great pleasure for me to address some of your many questions about this remarkable woman. If I may, I'm going to have to put on my glasses. My eyesight is not as good as it once was. So first up, we're hearing from Gry Elberg, if I've got that right. He asks, can I describe the Diana I knew? Well, the Diana I knew was amusing, not at all as she came across often in public. And what I mean by that is she had a very wry sense of humour. She knew about current affairs, what was going on in the world, and she was someone who had a great deal of interest in what was happening all about her and all around her. For someone who was so often at the centre of the headlines, as she was throughout really her time as a royal princess, she was remarkably uninterested about herself and much more in other things and other people. Having said that, you go on to ask whether she was as paranoid as the press say she was. I never thought Diana was paranoid at all, but you've got to remember she lived her life in a constant glow of publicity. It wasn't always kind to her. She found it very difficult. She made certain choices in her life which almost invited the kind of scrutiny that she was under. She gave up, for example, it was her decision to give up her police protection, so it meant that wherever she went, the paparazzi really had unhindered access to her, and some of them were absolutely brutal towards her. They wanted to try and provoke her into a reaction, and often that meant tears, and she would often fall into their trap. I mean, having said that, I think it's only fair to say that she understood the power of the media and what she could offer, and she knew that a certain look she gave to the cameras would dominate the newspaper coverage and might explain something that was going on in her life. I mean, she was quite canny in that regard, if you get what I mean. You further ask if I think she was too smart for Charles. No, I don't think she was too smart for Charles. I think there was a brief period in the 1980s where she was very much his yin to her yang, and they were an exceptionally good team. I mean, the fact is, for many years, the world and indeed the media reporting on them didn't know how grim the marriage was because they were so professional in public. Finally, you want to know if she had lived, do I think whether Charles would have married Camilla? Well, I think that's one of the $64,000 questions. I think the short answer, if she just lived, is that there would have been no marriage between Charles and Camilla. However, had Diana gone on to marry, whether it be Dodi Fayed or someone else, then I think that would have cleared the obstacles that would have prevented Charles marrying Camilla. But had she remained unmarried, I think it would have been extremely difficult for him to marry. Larky asks, how did she get together with Dodi, whether she was happy with him or was it more, as he puts it, to be provocative against the royals? Well, we know how she got together with Dodi. Dodi's father, Mohammed Al Fayed, the owner of Harrods at that time, invited, I would say instructed his son to come and join the family holiday that he was hosting at his compound in the south of France. Diana had gone there in July 1997 with William and Harry. People seem may have forgotten that she was someone who suddenly found herself rather exposed after her divorce from Charles, having to make arrangements for holidays which were inevitably had to be very secure for William and Harry. It presented a whole set of new difficulties for her. Fayed's offer of a holiday at his place with all the private security he had solved many of those problems. Whether she was right to take that holiday is another point. She and I disagreed very much on that. I thought he was using her, and I thought at the time that he was a bad figure. When I say a bad figure, he was a very controversial figure. He'd almost single-handedly brought down the then Conservative government in Britain by bribing members of Parliament. So no, I didn't think it was a good idea to go on holiday with him, but I understood why she did. Anyway, it was on that holiday that she met Dodi, and don't forget, Dodi had originally arrived in the south of France with a fiancé who he surreptitiously shielded from Diana by keeping her offshore, so to speak, on a separate boat from the one where his father was entertaining the princess. All very, a lot of skullduggery involved, I suspect, in how this romance is going. But nevertheless, it was a real romance, and I say that because it was the first time that Diana had sort of openly permitted, if you like, photographs, albeit long-distance ones, of her and a man to be taken. And there was a huge worldwide story and a huge interest in who this man was who had captured the princess's heart. Whether he had or not, I wasn't entirely sure, but he certainly was the man for the moment, and she was using it. Larky also asked if she was doing it to get at the royals, and I think there almost certainly was an element of that, because she knew that Fayed Senior was a very controversial figure, and it would also almost certainly be seen as a provocative move on her part. Catherine Brown, she asks, she remembers her being very sporty, and she wants to know what her exercise routine was like and what did she like or like not to eat. Well, Diana was very sporty. She had a series of brilliant personal trainers who completely transformed her physical shape. I mean, she got quite muscular at one stage, but it improved her sort of general frame, if you like. That habit that she had as a young woman of being slightly stooped all went away. So her routine was 3 times a week. She had her physical education, her physical trainer come to Kensington Palace. They did routines inside the palace. Very rarely did she venture outside because, you know why, because of the presence of the paparazzi. And she also had her daily swim at the Buckingham Palace indoor pool. That was a huge part of her routine. On food, well, frankly, Diana didn't eat very much, but she had a decent appetite. I had lunch with her on many occasions, and the chef would bring up some delightful food, usually some kind of poached fish or grilled chicken with salads. Nothing too creamy, but she did like a pudding. She didn't drink. She barely had anything to drink in all the time I knew her. She would occasionally sip at some champagne, but she always served some fabulous wine. I was allowed to tuck into the Kensington Palace wine cellar. But that's how she pretty much kept on top of things. Who were her close friends, Catherine also asked, and what did they like to do in their leisure times? Well, Diana's life changed a lot, certainly in those last years after her separation from Charles. She shed a lot of her sort of royal friends. Sadly, in my view, I think that was a great mistake. And she only had a very tight-knit group of close friends by the end of her life. What did they do? Well, I suppose I would consider myself one of them. We went to the cinema, we went out to dinner, we went to see some friends in their houses. She loved going to the coast for drives. I sometimes drive down to the south coast, and on occasions up to Norfolk, where she had lived as a little girl. And I remember one winter's day, we drove up to the North Norfolk coast, and we were determined to try and find her, the Spencer family's old changing hut on Brancaster Beach, those British institutions. Anyway, it was so covered in sand, and there's been so much erosion of the beach up there, it was very hard to find it. And we think we found it, and we stood on the roof of it. And I think she may even have taken a picture of me standing on it. Anyway, she liked seeing friends. She had a handful, as I say, of close friends, but she trusted few people. She felt she'd been so let down. Moving on, Swan Girl asks, did she really fall apart on the Australia tour with Charles? Well, she went to Australia on 3 occasions that I know officially with Charles, so I'm not entirely sure which one you mean, but the first one is probably the most famous. I didn't cover that trip. That was in 1983. She was still very young and famous. It was famous for the fact that they took the young Prince William with them, who was 9 months old. And it was also the birth of what became known as Di Mania. That's what the tabloids called it. And it was something to witness because huge crowds turned out. It wasn't just British people who were obsessed with the young princess, so too were people right around the world. And it was especially true in Australia. Lots of young women lined her route, and it was the beginning of what became known as I say, Di Mania. And for Charles, it was an entirely new experience because although he was very proud that his young wife was getting all this attention, this was a man who had sort of been born into the limelight, if you like, and suddenly he was not just having to share it, he was losing it. And I think it was an early sign of the tensions that were to come. Nee asks, was Diana religious? I know that royal family members are Church of England, but wondered if it was a priority to her and whether it was a comfort to her in tough times. Princess Diana was not particularly religious, but she took an interest in it. I don't think she was an active Anglican. She was obviously born into the Church of England, but the church she went to on occasions was very close to where I'm talking to you today from, in Kensington. It's a Catholic church on Kensington High Street, and she would occasionally go in there, pray, light a candle, and sit there in private contemplation. So often were her visits to this church and to other, and in fact her friendship with a number of Catholic figures, that people began wondering in the early 1990s whether she might, like her mother, convert to Catholicism, but she always assured me that that was not something she wanted to do. Katie B asks, what did Princess Diana want to be before she met the now King Charles? I think the short answer to that is a wife. She kind of thought from a young age that she was destined for a special role. She talked about that much later in those long series of interviews that were passed on to Andrew Morton, who wrote the devastating book about her marriage. She felt that someone was preparing a path for her, and the assumption was that it was to make a royal marriage. Had she not married Charles, I would have expected her to have married an aristocrat, the younger son of an earl perhaps, a landowner. I mean, I don't think she would have had a career as a businesswoman or any kind of career, actually. She wasn't academically clever, strategically very clever, but I don't think she didn't go to university, and I think her life would have been that as a mother and possibly the wife of a landowner. Peggy asks, the press seemed to have no mercy when chasing Diana around. Why didn't the royal family do more to protect her? And points out that she hasn't seen Catherine, the new Princess of Wales, having to run through the streets to get away from the cameras. What changed? The press were pretty merciless to Diana, but as I said earlier, only really after she made these rather controversial, at the time, changes to her life, standing down her police protection, she became much more of a target. I often used to question why she was prepared to put herself through all this, and didn't it make her much more vulnerable to potential attack and any other kind of physical assault that might have come her way. She took the view that her fame was her sort of guarantor of her safety, which was in a way slightly naive, but also quite remarkably astute, because it was absolutely true. When I was out with her and people saw her, and she was instantly recognizable, she had this very disarming way of sort of dealing with people who came up to her by saying, no, I'm not her, but people keep telling me I look like her, and how remarkable. But yeah, there is a contrast clearly with what happened to Diana when she was being cornered by the paparazzi with Catherine. But then Catherine was protected by the royal family and through her marriage to Prince William, as indeed Diana was to start with. But as I say, she made the changes that led to all those unseemly pictures of pursuit that came out. Fuzzy Poppet asks that she's read Catherine will soon be able to grant royal warrants. Why was Diana not given this opportunity? Well, we don't yet know whether Catherine will have an independent raft of royal warrants as others have in the past. Diana didn't, but she had them through Charles. She could have appointed people to receive the royal warrant simply by by asking her husband to organise it. She didn't have an independent, you're absolutely right, she didn't have her independent power to do it, and at the moment neither does Catherine, but maybe that will change her. Maybe that's a good thing. We're sort of allowing the wife to have some control over this sort of thing as well. Genevieve Chua, I hope I've got that right, asks, was there ever a moment in Diana's life that you witnessed firsthand which completely changed the way you saw her, something that the world never fully understood? I've often thought about that, Genevieve, and there was one moment I remember when she contacted me one day from Kensington Palace. As I mentioned, my office here at the Daily Mail is very, very close to the palace. It was one of the reasons why we were able to see each other quite often and quite quickly. And she got very excited about a convoy of cars that were going very close to Kensington Palace, passing by up beside the palace, and she wondered whose convoy it was, and I very quickly established it was the Sultan of Brunei, and she said, oh, how exciting, and we went and stood and watched this cavalcade as it went back again, and I made the point that nobody was interested and nobody was taking any notice. And she said, well, what are you saying? I said, well, if it had been you, Kensington would have come to a halt, and wherever the cars were going, thousands of people would have turned out to see you. But for the Sultan of Brunei, no, nobody really cared. And I thought the fact that she didn't quite get that, she looked at me askance and said, are you sure? I said, no, I'm certain. And it was as though she didn't really understand the power of her fame. Katie B asked, did Diana have a favourite country from royal tours, or a country she found the most fascinating? Well, she absolutely did have a favourite country, and it will come as no surprise to all our American viewers that it was the United States. She loved the US. I think that if she could, she would have moved there and lived there. She talked about it right at the very end of her life to me about settling for a time in the US. What held her back? Well, obviously, access to William and Harry. She couldn't just abandon them. They were young boys, and I don't think she had quite worked out how she could live in New York or California, for example, and maintain that close contact that she needed to have with William and Harry. But you know, as they got older, that might have changed, and I could see her living there. I often asked her what it was about America that attracted her to the country, and she said it was a sort of this idea that she had that she felt that she'd be freer somehow, that they took a much more nuanced attitude towards celebrity, and she based that assumption on the fact that Hollywood, and there were so many Hollywood stars who lived their lives pretty much unhindered, and she thought that she would just be one among many. When I pointed out that she would be the number one among many, she didn't agree. But that has always been my view, and in fact I think that's really what Prince Harry has found, that there was huge interest in him when he moved to California, quite above all those home-based American celebrity and Hollywood stars, and I think that would have plagued Diana just as much as it had plagued her really living in the United Kingdom. Pixie asks, was the coy look all a big act? The coy look, I'm assuming, Pixie, you mean that habit she had of sort of looking down and then looking up through her hair. That was a defence mechanism, quite frankly. No, she wasn't a shy woman. She was actually remarkably confident. She could stride into a room and pretty much make eye contact with anyone and deal with whatever was coming her way. But I think in the early days of her marriage, and when she was feeling under pressure, she did resort to dipping her head. At times she was biting her lip to try and stop the tears from falling. There was always some crisis, or so it seemed to me, going on in her life in the background. But no, I don't think it was a deliberate ploy, but it was a necessary defence mechanism. Deborah Hubble asks, do you think she would have worked with Kevin Costner on a project or more? Kevin Costner, the movie star, contacted her in late 96, early 97 to see if she would be interested in a remake of The Bodyguard. He had this dream of doing The Bodyguard Part 2 with Princess Diana, no less, in the Whitney Houston role. I mean, Diana was absolutely tickled pink by that. She thought Costner was a very dishy actor, but no, she had no plans to make a film with him. What Dizfan asks, was Diana always pro-monarchy? And I think this is a very important question, because a lot of people have criticised Diana, particularly in the years since her death, that she was out to destroy the House of Windsor, undermined it at every opportunity. That is palpably untrue. She was very pro-monarchy. Why? Because her son was its future. And, you know, she taught William that the Windsor side of his life was just as valid as her Spencer side, and she, I think, will ensure that King William, when he comes to the throne, will be a very well-balanced and well-rounded monarch. Bo asks, how much actual parenting did Diana do, and how much did the nanny do? Also, after the divorce, with whom did the boys live? Well, Diana was very much a hands-on parent, but she was also a young woman of her time and of her class. And at that time, in the 1980s, when the children were born, there was wraparound staff at Kensington Palace. There were butlers and valets, cooks, chauffeurs, and yes, nannies. But Diana had some very strict rules. She took the boys whenever she could to their London schools, as long as they fitted in with her engagements. Don't forget, she was often travelling up and down the country, sometimes abroad, so she couldn't do it all the time. But whenever she could, she would take the boys to school and collect them. She organised parties for their friends at Kensington Palace. She took them, the boys and lots of their friends, on away days. I remember their excursions to Disney World, for example, in Florida, and also go-karting and theme parks all over the United Kingdom. Who did the boys live with after the divorce? Well, the boys carried on living with their mother and their father. There had been a very strict division of time ever since the separation, really. Diana very magnanimously, in my view, allowed Charles always to have William and Harry at those important royal holiday events, Christmas, Easter. They were always with the Queen and the rest of the royal family at Windsor and at Sandringham. And Diana was prepared to allow that to happen. But otherwise, they divided their times between the nursery at Kensington Palace and their bedrooms at Highgrove House. Now then, Evelyn McGovern asks, where is Diana's sapphire and pearl choker? That is a stunning piece of jewellery which Diana had adapted from a brooch given to her as a wedding present by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which she sometimes actually did continue to wear as a brooch, but more often as a choker with, I think, was 7 strands of pearls. It is in the jewellery collection of William and Harry somewhere. When on Diana's death, all her personal jewellery was handed over to William and Harry, and they divided it up. It included her engagement ring, her wedding ring. There were obviously royal pieces in that collection which reverted to the Queen, and they have been seen around, I think, around the neck of Kate, and indeed, I think on one occasion on Camilla too. But as for the sapphire and pearl choker, that has never been seen since the princess's death, and as far as I know, it's held in the collection of jewellery that William and Harry, I guess, somehow hold jointly between them. Leo asks, since Diana's death, has the king, i.e. Charles, spoken much about her? And if so, what has he said? And has he said anything since he ascended the throne? The short answer to that is he hasn't said much, but he has said a little. In the immediate weeks and months after her death, he made a point of doing 2 things. One, reassuring William and Harry following the death of their mother that her presence would always still be felt. He flooded Highgrove House with photograph frames of his wife. However difficult that must have been for Charles himself, he did acknowledge that Diana had been a brilliant mother. And he did speak about her. He took on one of her interests in AIDS. I remember him going to an AIDS event where he spoke movingly about the contribution that his wife had made to battling AIDS. and he did a number of engagements over the succeeding years, which were directly associated with Princess Diana, but not so much since then. And precious little, really, I think, since he became king. I can't recall him saying anything in recent times about the influence of the princess. However, he has seen both William and Harry speak out about their mother, particularly so on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of her death, when they both contributed to documentaries and spoke very movingly about how important Diana was in their lives. Amanda Scriwer, if I got that right, asks, how did Diana handle friction and fights between William and Harry while they were growing up? Well, she handled them pretty much like any mum did. She said enough of that, occasionally gave them a cuff and a gentle slap, but she was quite sharp with them. She would stop them squabbling. They often fought when they were in the back of the car with her. And they were well-behaved boys, and if their mother lost their temper with them, then they knew they were in big trouble and they would shut up. Gwyn Sobrel asks, how do you think William will continue to protect Diana's legacy, especially when he ascends to the throne? He once said as a young teen that he would restore her HRH when he was king. Is that even possible? Good couple of questions here, Gwyn. I think William is very conscious of bringing Diana with him on his journey from heir in line to heir and then eventually to monarch. We've seen him speak about her, as I say, not just on occasions to mark the anniversaries that have passed on her death, but also when he got engaged, he talked about how he wanted his mother to be part of his and Kate's journey. Princess Charlotte has Diana among her names. She was also christened at the church where his mother was christened at Sandringham. So I think there are subtle signs that William will always keep his mother close. But there's a very crucial question here you ask about that HRH status. On divorce, Diana lost her HRH. A lot was made of it at the time. It was described as a rather cruel act on behalf of the royal family. Although Diana had volunteered to lose it, she did come to regret it. She confided in me on several occasions that she wished she had managed to keep it. I understood why it happened, but I also felt there was a very strong case as a mother of a future king why it should have been kept for her. And yes, it was reported, I reported it actually, because Diana told me that William had said, "Don't worry, Mummy, I'll give you your HRH back." Yes, he could do that. He could make sure that when the princess is referred to at landmark events, her HRH is restored. It is something he could do. It would be very simple. Will he do it or not? I really don't know. He hasn't given any indication as a young man that it's in his thinking, but it wouldn't at all surprise me if he did. Debster asks, coming straight to the point and bringing us bang up to date, about how long after meeting Meghan Markle would she, Diana, have sent her packing. Debster says, I think 5 minutes tops. Well, I hate to disagree with you, Debster, and none of us really know, but I think there is something about Meghan that Diana would have found not just intriguing, but slightly liberating. I think she would have admired Harry's decision to settle in America. She wouldn't have admired, however, the rift with William. But I think she would have liked Meghan's independence and the fact that she was able to offer Harry an escape route, if you like, from royal duty. So I think I don't think she would have given a short shrift. I think she would have been very disappointed by how things panned out, but I think initially she would have been very welcoming to her. That's my view. I hope you've enjoyed all that. We try to get through as much as we can. If you've got any more questions, send them in. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, you know how to do that by now. For more great royal videos, please subscribe to the Daily Mail Royals YouTube channel.